The act of keeping a slave or slaves is slavery. This is a social system where someone or some people become the property of some other person. This unfortunate practice has existed around the world for a very long time, and it exists in many areas and in many forms. Well, there are lots of records of forms of slavery that existed in global history. Let's look at the write-up of J.C. Anele. J.C. Anele, in his write-up, stated that the ancient records of the Assyrians, the Egyptians, the Phoenicians, the Hebrew, the Indians, and the Chinese are full of references to slaves and the type of labor on which they were usually employed. The ancient records of the Assyrians, the Egyptians, the Phoenicians, the Hebrews, the Indians, and the Chinese are full of references to slaves and the types of labor on which they were usually employed. There were some ancient economic giants that were built on the institution of slavery practices. The two notable ones were the Greek society, the ancient Greek society, and the Roman Empire society. The ancient Greek society and the Roman Empire society. There are some analysis that stated that up to 90% of the ancient Greek population can be characterized as slaves. That up to 90% of the ancient Greek population can be characterized as slaves. This was because of the natural free and natural slave status of the ancient Greek society. This can be seen in the exclamation of Aristotle, where Aristotle wrote that certain people are naturally free and others are naturally slaves. Aristotle wrote that certain people are naturally free while others are naturally slaves. The same analysis can be found in the Roman Empire society. The society of the Romans had more slaves than free men. Most of the slaves that existed in the Roman Empire were brought in from Europe, Asia, and Africa. Most of the slaves that existed in Roman Empire were brought in from Europe, Asia, and Africa. They were made to do labor works as servants, jesters, made to do jester works, and also tillers of soil. Some other roles or activities they did were hairdressers, gladiators, musicians, and other roles. The same situation can be said about China, Europe, and the Muslim countries. In Europe, slavery was a bit brutal. Let's look at the write-up of L.M. Okafor. L.M. Okafor stated that to the European, a slave was helpless before his master, because his master could treat him anyhow without mercy. As a tool in the hands of his master, he had no rights and privileges. He could not marry without his master's permission. He could be sold out of his family to another master. Any member of his family could likewise be sold, and both him and the member of his family could never become free people. Let's go through it again. To the European, a slave was helpless before his master, because his master could treat him anyhow without mercy. As a tool in the hands of his master, he had no rights and privileges. He could not marry without his master's permissions. He could be sold out of his family to another master. Any member of his family could likewise be sold, and both him and the members of his family could never become free people. European groups brutally enslaved their weak neighbors, and even those among them who were of lower status in their societies. While in the African societies, before the establishment of the transatlantic slave trade, slavery differed in most places. It might be a bit difficult to generalize the concept of slavery in the African societies before the transatlantic slave trade era. There were some African societies or African groups whose societal structures had no room for slavery. They had different orientations and interests. An example of such group in Africa was the Maasai group. The Maasai group showed no interest in slavery despite being a very powerful group. They were more interested in economic reality, as most of them were nomadic cattle rearers. So the main focus is economic realities, economic desires. There were different forms of slavery in African society. But one basic thing about slavery in African society is that majority or most of the African societies created slavery structures where slaves were treated like human beings, not like tools. Household slaves were regarded as members of their masters' families and were not treated differently in most cases. The slaves and members of their families could not be sold to another master. In some African societies, some of these slaves grew to high levels or high societal social levels. Some African kings allowed slaves to be part of their army. Some of these slaves that were part of the army rose to the ranks of army generals in some empires, kingdoms, and political units in Africa. However, the treatment of slaves depends on the means of their enslavement. In some African societies, some of the slaves captured during wars were sold. Some of them were sacrificed. Some were killed. And even to a very high level, some were cannibalized. There were some slavery systems or structures that can be called or can be referred to as personal service or personal services as means of debt settlement. These can be seen as a slave status by some persons. This was a situation where someone decided to dedicate his or her services to another person because of his or her inability to pay back debts. There were lots of some persons that actually did this in African societies. Some may refer to it as some form of slavery, while some persons may disagree. This was because when the debtor gets to a point whereby his or her services was able to clean up the debt he or she owed, he or she was free to walk away. There were also areas of loyalty for protection. Some persons decided to show loyalty to some powerful individuals for protection in some societies in Africa. Jesse Anene explained this in this way. He said, in an age where unprotected men and women unprotected man or woman exposed himself or herself to loss of personal freedom, submission to the protection of a powerful man amounted to insurance against slavery. Let me repeat it again. In an age where an unprotected man or woman exposed himself or herself to loss of personal freedom, submission to the protection of a powerful man amounted to an insurance against slavery. While some people may see this as a form of slavery, some other persons might disagree to this. But in some African societies, such social practice was being implemented. The bottom line was that people that pledged loyalty to the powerful man or powerful woman were well treated. Well, they too brought in some level of services or brought in some economic compensation to the powerful man or powerful woman. The period of the introduction of Islam in some African societies increased the issue of slavery in Africa. With the introduction of Islam in some areas in Africa, slavery increased. This was because of the changes in social and economic structures in the area where Islam was introduced. Then Jesse Anene explained it in this way. He stated that the tilling of the soil, household chores, the care of the harem, and so forth were recognized assignments for slaves. In some cases, wealthy and property consisted almost entirely in slaves. In some cases, wealth and property consisted almost entirely in slaves. In North Africa and the Sudan states, eunuchs were acquired as reliable harem keepers, courtiers, and guards of the palace. Let me read it again for better understanding. And I stated that the tilling of the soil, household chores, the care of the harem, and so forth were recognized assignments for slaves. In some cases, wealth and property consisted almost entirely in slaves. In North Africa and Sudan states, eunuchs were acquired as reliable harem keepers, courtiers, and guards of the palace. The introduction of Islam brought in some structural changes and social status reality. These structural changes and social status reality increased the level of slavery in Africa, and to a certain level brought in some level of uncomfort or brutality in slavery practices in Africa.